Okay, so I will share my screen. We'll make sure that this works. And whoever's watching at home in the future can bear with me as I try to do this. Okay, so present. Oops, we're using Canva today. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want. The reason I keep them muted is just, I don't know if anybody's been in the ever echoing hallway of microphones on at the same time. So that's why I do that. Okay, so we will get started. All right, so intuitive eating, but in the context of eating disorder recovery. I did this presentation for the first time last year at one of our Christmas workshops. So it is really similar to what I shared last year, just with a few tweaks. But yeah, we're going to talk about this concept. It gets talked about in the eating disorder recovery community a lot. You may have heard about it yourselves from treatment providers, or even just like doing your own kind of research. And yeah, it's a really lovely approach to food and nutrition, movement that is ideally compatible with recovery in a way that so many other things are not. So it's not for everybody as an approach to food and movement, but certain aspects of it I think are universal in the recovery process. So I hope that you guys enjoy learning about it. We will start with, me. So my name's Christine. Like I said, I'm a registered dietitian. I'm also a therapist to be, so I'm doing my master's in counseling psychology right now to become a psychotherapist. So I'm really interested in psychology. I like to start with just kind of identifying some areas of privilege that I have and just how I identify. So I'm cisgendered, I'm a white female, I'm moderate income, I have thin privilege. So for those of you who haven't heard that before, just the idea that I don't experience weight stigma in my body. And I carry privilege because of that. And even doing a presentation like this, I carry privilege. And so I like to acknowledge that right up front, that I don't have an experience of living in a larger body and what that's like in our society. But I will be talking about it today. So I'm not talking about my own lived experience. I am talking about the culture that we're in and possibly other people's lived experiences as well. So I'm also queer identifying as well. I grouped that with all my professional stuff for some reason. So I'm a weight inclusive dietitian. I practice a health at every size approach. Basically, all that means is that I don't pathologize weights in eating disorder recovery or in general. And I do my best to try to not perpetuate weight stigma and fat phobia in healthcare. And I help people take care of themselves in a way that really aligns with their experiences and their values. I'm not the expert, I'm a collaborator. That's sort of the general sense of it. And it is a social justice point of view when it comes to providing nutrition care. And many eating disorder dietitians do fall into this category. And we'll learn about that a little bit more. I'm going to reference it later in the presentation. Yeah, I'm also anti-diet or non-diet, just meaning that I don't believe in dieting. I don't believe in specific restrictive diets, except for when really necessary for people, when they have allergies or things like that. I'm a feminist. And yeah, I work in eating disorder treatment in my private practice in Ottawa, which is now all virtual. A little more on the fun side, just because I think, again, I'm not the expert, I'm just a person. I always like to add like my hobbies at the bottom. So I really like cafes. I'm really glad that we're able to pop into cafes now and like grab a coffee. That was really challenging at the start of the quarantine. I love hiking and ballet, art, craft fairs, farmers markets. Note the rewatching of TV shows. It takes a lot for me to watch a new show. And then if I really like it, I'll rewatch it. And yeah, I love movies and books and yeah, history and yeah, lots of different hobbies. And as I mentioned, I do have my own lived experience with an eating disorder. And so a cool part of recovery and part of what I do is that I get to help other people in their recovery process And yeah, like look at all the hobbies I have now. I have a lot more mental space now to do what I really love and to do presentations like this. So yeah, we will get started. So what is intuitive eating? Sorry, I'm just moving around everyone's faces. I know you can't see that necessarily. It distracts me, so I'm just trying to move it to a spot where I can see a little better. Okay, so this is the cover of the book that was written by 2 dietitians. There's actually a new version out now. So intuitive eating was founded by these 2 dietitians in the States working in eating disorder treatment. And they were also seeing people for a wide range of health issues. And they started to realize that in their counseling practices, they would talk one way to clients with eating disorders, and they would talk another way to people who would be coming in for weight loss, which is something that, people think of dietitians and we kind of get colluded together with that, which is annoying. And they didn't like that either. And they didn't like how they were practicing. So they developed this approach. And this was like over 20 years ago. And it's since been researched pretty heavily. It's kind of an ongoing thing. And it's being talked about in eating disorder treatment specifically, which is why I'm doing a presentation on it. So the basic overview is that it's a dynamic mind-body integration. So, it's not just about, it really isn't about just what you're eating. Like that's such a small piece of intuitive eating. It's also how you feel, what your body feels like, your mental health, challenging sort of difficult thoughts around food and body image, which sounds a lot like what we talk about in recovery, which is why I think it's such a great approach, because we're all on a full spectrum of disordered eating because of the culture that we live in. Yeah, the idea is you're honoring your health by paying attention to the messages of your body, but also not just thinking about physical needs, but also your emotional and social needs with food, or cultural needs as well. All those things play a role. And we know that nutrition care traditionally is rooted in racist, fat-phobic kind of commentary and research. And so this approach, although it is created by 2 white women and there's issues with that, we also know that it's something that's been helpful across populations, but it still isn't perfect. If you struggle with being able to afford food, parts of intuitive eating are really difficult. But as far as being, an acceptable approach across different groups, it does a really good job of that. There's 10 principles, which is what this presentation is mostly, just so you guys get to know, like, what is this when we hear about it. So this is very much a 101 presentation. And I always have here, no rules. It's not a diet. This is not something that, the eating disorder sometimes for some people can manifest and just take over something. And there certainly are aspects of intuitive eating that can be switched over and colluded with eating disorder, but overall, it's a really good pro-recovery kind of approach to, your relationship with food and yourself and your body. So we will get started with a really important reminder. So it's not a mandatory journey or destination in eating disorder recovery. I've seen people recover who use meal plans and they continue to use meal plans. I've seen people in recovery who, maybe practicing certain aspects of intuitive eating, but didn't formally actually learn about it. So, you guys are all learning about it formally, which is lovely. But if there's parts of it that just don't sit well with you, or that you don't think you want to do at this point, that's okay. It's not mandatory to use it in recovery. But there certainly are aspects that will complement other aspects of treatment and recovery. Whole thing here, you don't need to be an intuitive eater to be fully recovered. Being an intuitive eater in the definition that's used in this approach can be really tricky for someone with an eating disorder history at times. And so I'll touch on why as we go through the principles. But it is possible. It's possible to become an intuitive eater with an eating disorder history. And it's not a perfect, like, you aren't either an intuitive eater or not. It's just an approach. It's an approach to how you interact with food. And so it's, it's kind of great because we don't have to have that all or nothing black and white kind of thinking. It can be something that we just are interested in and we try to implement in our life, and there's not really a right or wrong way to do that. Yeah, it's not the only way. Everyone's recovery is different. And a really big component here too, and I'll probably remind all of you this, is that if you are working with a therapist, with a dietitian, it's like one of those things. You have autonomy. You can share concepts. You can say what you want to do, but at the same time, it might be good if there was something in this presentation or a concept that you really wanted to work on, to share that with them, versus just going off on your own. And I say that not because you can't trust yourself, but more just if you have a treatment team, just as well tell them what you're thinking about, because that could be a useful discussion in the recovery process. Okay. So principle number 1 is arguably the most important one. That's why it's the first one. So it's rejecting the dieting mentality. And this goes back to what I was saying when I was talking about my different levels of privilege, and I'm sure I missed some. But that idea of weight stigma and fat phobia and diet culture. So we live in a culture where we're just completely immersed in that, where we have biases around people's weight and shape and stigma. It's referred to as diet culture soup by another dietitian, Christy Harrison. And I think that's just such an accurate way to put it. So whether you have an eating disorder or not, we're all immersed in that. And yeah, it's icky, and it makes recovery really difficult, which is why it gets us eating disorder treatment providers all riled up. So we're thinking about the dieting mentality, though. That's a little bit more specific to individually trying to push away all those messages of diet culture that, you've now internalized. Reminding yourself that diets are not sustainable. They're harmful. They don't work. They perpetuate fat phobia. Certainly, something like going on a diet, whatever that means, could be the trigger for developing an eating disorder. And so it's never really a safe option. And yet we see people doing it all the time. So really rejecting that mentality. I like to think of this in eating disorder recovery as like rejecting the eating disorder, rejecting that eating disorder voice in a way, and what it values. And that's like a complicated process, because obviously eating disorder behaviors and the eating disorder itself serves a purpose for each of us. And I know personally, I can look back on certain parts of it and go, yeah, that helped me in the short term, but it harmed me in the long term. Or I thought it was helping me, but it really wasn't. It was keeping me stuck. So however you view your eating disorder, however you view your eating disorder voice, we still have to challenge it, and we have to challenge those urges and behaviors. And so this kind of ties into that really well. This is where I'm referring to 2 books. So Health at Every Size and Body Respect by Lindo Bacon. They go by they now as their pronouns. So they have written these 2 books. Body Respect is the newest one. So if you had to pick, that's the one to read. That's where they talk about all the science behind how weight stigma harms people, how that is actually what perpetuates a lot of health issues that we see, and that the evidence just doesn't, it's not there to say that weight loss interventions are safe. And I think that's really important in eating disorder recovery, because eating disorders can happen to people of any shape and size. And that causes a lot of issues, right, when people are trying to get support. And so having that understanding, or immersing yourself in learnings and language that talks about how we need to be working on helping people have access to their, basic needs, and supporting their mental health and supporting their well-being, and decreasing those social determinants or I should say improving social determinants of health, decreasing those barriers for people instead of targeting people and focusing on something as insignificant as the number on the scale. And so, yeah, it's a cool value system to have, as I like to think of it as you've got your recovery fire. If you learn about health at every size and weight inclusive approaches, it's like putting just fuel on the fire in a good way, where it just makes you a lot more, it just gives you a tool. It's a tool to be more resilient and to really reject these concepts for reasons that are, systematic and bigger than us. So yeah, that's the first one. And it's, yeah, one of the most important principles. It's also one of the hardest. And the thing with this approach, the 10 principles, they're not really sequential. I say this is the most important one, and the last one is the one that we do last. But really, people kind of go on their own map when they're learning about these. And I think this is something that we never stop having to unlearn because of the culture that we're in. We kind of constantly have to reject things that diet culture tells us around like what foods are good for you, what foods are not, the moralities that we hold around food and bodies. We kind of have to unlearn that constantly, hopefully not forever, but that's the world we're in right now. So as it is COVID times, I will reference social media in presentations because that's where we all are anyways. So I shared these 2 posts last year too, actually. I really like them, from Christy Harrison. So what is diet culture? So it's a system of beliefs that idolizes white supremacist beauty standards, like that we're highlighting the racist sort of history of it. It promotes weight loss at all costs, demonizes certain ways of eating while elevating others. We all know what those are. We may have internalized those as part of our eating disorder. And the big one here is it oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health. And we see this in how we talk about people in larger bodies and the experiences that they have seeking support not being very great. And yeah, she has a little post here around like whatever the motivation is to decrease your body size, change your shape, our bodies reject it. It doesn't feel right for our body. And so, it doesn't matter what the intention is. If we're really focusing on that, our body is being harmed. And that's sort of the background that I have in the back of my mind whenever I'm working with people and talking about their history with with an eating disorder, with dieting, whatever it might be. That one of the most important things to understand is just how difficult it is on the body physiologically. And it doesn't matter what size you are. It's still really, really hard on your body. And it can be a really scary thing. And I know a lot of you know that already. Okay. So that's why it's important, because obviously diet culture is not the cause of eating disorders, but I would argue that it is a huge, huge infiltrator. And it's also something that helps people maintain disordered behaviors. So that's why we try to challenge it in eating disorder recovery as well. Principle number 2, honoring your hunger. So this principle, so intuitive eating is not like designed specifically for people in eating disorder recovery. It's meant to be an approach that a lot of people can use to kind of guide themselves. I would say in eating disorder recovery, honoring your hunger can be kind of problematic if you don't have hunger cues, or if your hunger is also followed by really like getting full really quickly, then it's not going to be as reliable. And so sometimes the eating disorder hijacks this principle, which is why it's good to do it with a lot of guidance. Something I say to my clients all the time is that when you feel full, that isn't always an accurate cue, because in eating disorder recovery, early onset fullness is a symptom as you start eating more. And so it's not always great or like something we can trust. But hunger is always, always real. It's just like any other body cue. So if you like need to go to the bathroom, or you're getting tired, or we try to resist getting tired too, I think. But the point is, usually we know we're tired and that we're kind of like pushing past it. With hunger, it's the same thing. It's just an innate cue. And so if you do feel hunger, that's what it is. And I think that can be helpful. It can be a helpful process when you're in eating disorder recovery and you're eating, and your eating disorder is like, well, should I eat this? If you're hungry, the answer is always yes. And I think it can take some onus off of you for having to micromanage it all the time, which is difficult when you're in recovery, but it's one step in letting go of that process. So also in eating disorder recovery, feeding your body at consistent times and intervals established by you and your dietitian. So that might mean, eating more mechanically for a while, right? And knowing that you're actually honoring your body's hunger in the sense of making sure you're eating often enough to anticipate like your body's needs, even if you're mentally and physically not really into it. And that can be a way of just kind of getting back on track and, doing the hard thing that you have to do. And so it still applies. It's just a little different. You wouldn't necessarily be tuning into your body as much if your hunger cues are kind of a little wonky. The other piece around this is that like tuning into your hunger cues and like the way your stomach feels, that can be really difficult. And so sometimes that's not where we start. We start with like noticing what our ears feel like, or noticing how certain emotions show up in our body. And I think that's a very individual thing of whether any of those things are safe. So that's something you'd want to probably talk about with, someone you trust, your therapist, dietitian, somebody. Learning that hunger is simply a cue, that your body needs to be fed. It needs energy. There's a lot of reasons why you're going to need more energy some days than others, which is why being really meticulous with numbers is not actually helpful for anyone, because our body's needs fluctuate day to day. And also viewing hunger as a cue can help us sort of reduce those feelings of guilt or shame that come up, because we're normalizing it. It's something that everybody has, and it doesn't make us any better or any worse, really, depending on like how hungry we get. But that can be hard because the eating disorder can hijack that principle as well. So yeah, something to talk about with the team, but hunger is real is the theme of that one. Okay, so making peace with food. I just want to make sure I forgot. Okay, yeah, making peace with food is probably my favorite principle. You don't have to have a favorite, but this is mine. Because to me, making peace with food is like a third of recovery for most of us. You'll notice in our Hopewell groups, we don't often separate based on symptoms of an eating disorder. We occasionally have separated groups by age, but often not by eating disorder. And part of it is that everybody with an eating disorder has some aspects of their experience in common, because the eating disorder is basically just the symptoms of some of these deeper emotional issues. And the groups are meant to be a place where you get support in, the recovery process and how hard it is, but it's also a place to share what else is going on in your life, what's triggering you, what's leading you to use your eating disorder, because it's a coping mechanism. And it can be a very effective one and very, very hard to shake. But obviously it has a lot of consequences. So making peace with food to me is like eating disorder recovery food-wise. That's like what it represents. So it's learning to eat really with unconditional permission, and eating all foods that you want to eat. I think that's kind of the goal sometimes when we're working with a dietitian, is you may go from a certain number of foods and you expand and you build on those and you challenge yourself. And all of a sudden there's foods that you used to not be able to eat, but now you can, or just foods that you found you had a difficult relationship with, whatever that looks like in your experience. And so this principle is really about working towards giving ourselves truly unconditional permission to eat all foods and knowing that we deserve to do that. They talk about attunement to hunger and fullness levels, and I put in brackets, and they talk about this most of the time, not all of the time, and with care and recovery. So again, tuning into hunger and fullness early on in recovery or after a period of restriction is not going to be safe. And it's something you'd want to hopefully get some support or some reflection with your dietitian around, like, is it a good time? Like, what do you think? It's always good to talk to your provider about that. And you can experiment with it, but just know that if your hunger cues are kind of off, or you're getting early onset fullness, this isn't going to be, that part of it is not going to apply to you. But that full permission or unconditional permission to eat the foods you want to eat is such an important part of recovery. So that really is for everybody. Making food choices emotionally equal. So unlearning the shame or guilt, unlearning the labels of good and bad. The only foods that are really truly bad for us are ones that we're allergic to, ones that are poisoned. And I'm not saying that lightly. I know some people really have very strong fears about that. But, if we can safely assume that most, if not all of the foods in the grocery store are safe and edible based on food safety standards, there are truly no good or bad foods. And our bodies are really good at adapting to different types of foods. And I like to think of food and nutrition as more of like a self-care kind of thing rather than a restrictive thing. And that's kind of my approach in recovery as well. So yeah, just toning down the emotional ties that we have to certain foods. And that can take a lot of time and processing in therapy and in working with a dietitian, and sometimes just on your own, doing your own stuff. The other thing here too, so I said guilt. So the idea of like, oh, I've done something wrong, but that can turn into shame. So shame is different because it's saying I'm wrong for doing these things, or I'm wrong just by the fact that I want to eat these things. There's something wrong with me. And we can feel that shame in recovery when we don't feel like we're doing recovery well enough. So that can be a really vicious cycle. So there's no morality with food in intuitive eating. We really try to neutralize things. And also to remind people that you're not better for eating a certain way. You may have a meal that feels better for you in your body and that you enjoy more, but you aren't morally better. And that can be important because the eating disorder loves to tell us that we're doing something better, that we're unique, or that this makes us safer. When it doesn't. It's a false sense of safety or control or security. And then simultaneously, when we go against the eating disorder and we eat something that the eating disorder doesn't want us to eat, and it starts to just throw the insults, we're not a bad person for having ice cream with our friends, as an example. So yeah, it's kind of this idea of, which I really love, that health isn't an obligation for people. We sometimes act like it is, but it really isn't. A lot of us would like to feel better and ideally live longer or live better quality lives. And health certainly helps us with that. But at the same time, what somebody else does with food or with their body is really none of our business. And that's including me as a provider. When somebody comes to seek support from me, I have to remind myself that it's still not my place to tell them what is and isn't okay. I can offer my interpretations and let them decide if that's something that works for them. So it's good to remember this for yourselves too, I think, that yeah, you're under no obligation to have to figure out recovery and figure out, what health means to you. Like it can be an ongoing process or a process that you don't engage in at all. And maybe moving away from the concept of health is actually what you need to do. Okay, so principle number 4 is challenging the food police. Another lovely meme. This is from Jennifer Rowland. I cropped it. She said, it's healthier than kale, recovering from your eating disorder. I love dry humor, so that was good. So challenging the food police, which is essentially challenging the eating disorder voice or the eating disorder thoughts. And for somebody without an eating disorder, we can still relate to this idea of like a critical voice around how we relate to food in our body. So these are the food rules that we have. The rules that dictate how we eat, what we eat, what's good and bad, and also what other people around us have told us. So we could have had influences from caregivers or teachers, sometimes, partners, just society in general. And so this concept is based off of cognitive behavioral therapy and reframing thoughts. And it does talk about like thought distortions that we have that end up making us feel worse than we need to, basically, or, will make us feel sad or angry when it's not warranted. And so the idea is reframing it so that we can have these thoughts be a little more like, okay, what's the evidence for it? What's the evidence against it? And here's my new reframed thought that takes in all that information. And it's important to remember too, that like some of these thoughts, may bring up certain feelings, and the feelings aren't wrong and it's okay to feel them. And, but when it's guilt, right, or shame constantly because of thoughts we're having around our bodies or who we are, or the food that we're eating, then yeah, we want to challenge those. We want to try to create a new dialogue internally. And another part of this is self-compassion. So if we're thinking about, you're challenging the food police, that's a really critical voice. The eating disorder voice is very unkind and mean. And so self-compassion is basically saying, like, I don't need to punish myself, or, I'm okay the way I am. There's a lot of acceptance. Also acknowledging how difficult your experiences might be and how you're not alone with those. I mean, look at Hopewell as a case in point. If you go to a support group, you're there with a bunch of other people who are struggling with something similar to you. So there's that common humanity. And then the other piece, which I really love about self-compassion, is that you're identifying, like, okay, like, my body not being the size that I want it to be, or, my life being the way it is, and the stigma that I face, or whatever issues resonate with you, whatever you feel, like, let yourself feel it and say, like, yeah, like, this is really difficult. And then ask yourself, what do I actually need? Because the eating disorder behaviors just mask those needs and those emotions. And yeah, then we stay in that cycle. So the idea of self-compassion is saying, yeah, like, I am really sad because I've gained weight in recovery, and I'm afraid that I'm not going to, find someone. And I'm thinking of this as an example, and nobody's going to find me attractive, or I'm not going to be loved the way I am, or the way who I am is not enough. Like, whatever the pieces are, that can all be underneath it. And so self-compassion just basically says, like, you are enough, and you deserve to have your emotions, like, heard and seen, and you yourself can provide yourself with validation and say, yep, I am really sad today, I am really anxious, whatever it is, and figure out what you need that isn't necessarily the eating disorder behavior. Even if you just used an eating disorder behavior, you can still take that, like, next step. So that's what this one's all about. Okay, I'm gonna take a breather here. Are you guys following along okay? Yeah, good. Okay. All right, so I've taken a little break here. So yeah, so I'll read this. It says principles fuel your fullness, which again, I already mentioned in the beginning. Connecting with your physical sensations of fullness is not that simple when you're in early stages of recovery or dealing with any sort of restrictive type behaviors. It can be difficult for anyone. And so it's a principle that we have to really address with caution. We know fullness is affected by so many different things. And during, the eating disorder can convince you that you're full when you're not, which is really disturbing, but it happens. But also, it can be influenced by, like, physical things, like how much food you've had and your hunger levels, and, the type of food that you ate, and all those things play a role. And so when I work with clients on this, even those who are further along in recovery, we're experimenting. That's what it is. We're trying to figure out, not like, it's like, oh, like, how long does this snack keep me full? And it's not a disorder thing. It's not judgmental. It's more of just, like, understanding how certain meals or snacks feel in your body, and what actually is satisfying, and what, it physically feels satisfying, which is not something eating disorders really do. There's so many rules and so many restrictions often for most people that we're not really thinking about what will satisfy us or what will feel good for us. It's different motivations. And so in some ways, this principle is actually really good for starting to challenge that and starting to think about, like, fullness is something that I deserve to feel. It's not something that I have to earn. Jennifer Rowland, again, therapist in the States, she says, feeling uncomfortably full as you're renourishing your body is not a sign that you've done something wrong. It means that your body is healing. And so having mental and physical discomfort with fullness, with bloating, with all of those lovely things that can happen when we haven't been nourishing our body and we have a lot of anxiety around eating, it makes sense that it's going to be uncomfortable. And yeah, it's the most normal and necessary thing in recovery, because it's a sign that you are trying to eat more. You are trying to eat more often, whatever it is that you're working on. You're trying to nourish your body on a regular basis. And if it's not used to that, it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy road. Okay. Oh, we can't travel there. That's a photo from Italy. Eventually we'll be able to go. So discovering the satisfaction factor. So we often will, in our culture, talk about pleasure with eating as if it's a bad thing, and think that if we're eating healthy, that it shouldn't be pleasurable. And that's just so far from the truth, because we should be feeling good. Like, we should be enjoying what we're eating. Our bodies are geared for that. You know, if we smell something that we like, our stomach starts rumbling, that's a good thing. That's like our body preparing itself to digest food. And, you know, it can be really miserable to really be foregoing pleasure so often. And, you know, there's that stereotype or that myth that people with eating disorders don't like food, and that just isn't true. You know, again, everybody's different in their own experience, but a lot of people love food, and it's just really difficult to give themselves permission, right? So in eating disorder recovery, the satisfaction factor is like when you do a food challenge and you ordered that ice cream cone, for example, and it's scary and it's difficult, but you did it, and it's something that was really satisfying. And you may even eat with other people around you and, you know, realize, wow, this is what I'm doing recovery for. So I can have an ice cream with my friends and not have that like make me spiral mentally. And it sounds silly when I say it in a lot of ways, but I think it's just important to remember that that food piece is like the tip of the iceberg. The spiraling is not truly from that ice cream cone. It's from like all the feelings about ourselves and our ways of coping with stress, you know, and maybe even how we are in relationships. There's a lot of things that we might be dealing with that really don't feel good. But when you're challenging the eating disorder and you go against it and you do something a little more scary, and ice cream isn't a challenge food for everybody, but it's just a common example. Sometimes when you do that, you basically just like, you know, the eating disorder, you kind of shook it down a little bit, where you've basically gone against it and had a pleasurable experience with food. And the more times you do that, the more you learn that it's worth it. Like, it's worth it to have those moments. And that it does get easier, which is the important thing, I think, to remember, because it can be quite a slog when you're trying to challenge foods. It can take a really long time before it does feel good. Yeah, so the satisfaction factor is important. You know, even in early stages of recovery, you know, even if you're picking foods that feel safer for you, you can still be thinking about which of those foods do I like more, not what the eating disorder likes more, but what do I like more. You can take small steps to introducing this in your recovery, even early on. And I was saying, start small and with support. This is something certainly you would do with treatment providers, but if you're not seeing a therapist or not seeing a dietitian, you're kind of doing this on your own, this might be something that you connect with, like a good friend, or another kind of support, maybe a mentor through Hopewell, and you might be doing this with them. Okay, so coping with your feelings, cheesy poster of a therapist, a client. I don't know why I put that there, but that's what therapy is. I think everybody knows what therapy is. That's what therapy used to be. Now it's all virtual. So the post that Jennifer Rowland has here, she says, restricting food to numb out from the sadness or anxiety eventually numbs you out from your whole life. So coping with your feelings without using disordered behaviors is challenging, because like I said right at the beginning, an eating disorder is in large a coping mechanism for a lot of other issues. And, you know, it means that coping with our feelings in other ways is something that we have to work on. And mostly I would say in therapy, but it can be done on your own as well. So, you know, if we think of food, it's this idea too that like coping with food makes sense, because food is something that we use to celebrate and nurture. It's supposed to provide pleasure, otherwise we wouldn't seek it out, and sometimes comfort as well. And so yeah, it's actually okay to eat for emotional reasons. And that's actually something I think to normalize, regardless of what kind of eating disorder you're struggling with, what kind of behaviors you're struggling with. Just like knowing that that's okay, and that you have permission to do that, I think can be helpful. Just again, in reducing those levels of guilt and shame that can come up. So yes, it's a way to cope, totally normal way to cope. But if it's our only way to cope, we may be using it to escape from emotions or escape from situations that we really need to face and process. And so that's where we start to say, well, are there other ways for us to cope with our feelings? And depending on the eating disorder behavior, coping with your feelings with using the eating disorder is really, really harmful and risky, possibly. So like, what are like ways of, doing that behavior less often might be a place to start. Or, what's an alternative, 2 days out of the week that you can use, and you kind of build up those, that toolbox. Yeah, and the idea too, just that, emotions are messengers. They're a key part of being human. They're really innate, like they're there in our, primal brain, caveman brain, whatever you want to call it. Emotions were there before we were really expressing ourselves through language. So they're meant to be listened to. And yeah, if we don't acknowledge them, they get louder. And that's called amplification in psychology, where, if you're sad, but you don't truly deal with it and you find ways to push it down, you get more sad. You feel it more until you can't not feel it. I'm sure many of you can relate to situations like that. That's really normal. Emotional intelligence is not something in our mainstream culture. Like, we push away emotions regularly. We reward people for doing that. And so it makes sense if you find that difficult as well. Okay, so we're getting to the last 3 principles. Respecting your body. So I love this body image therapist, Ashley Bennett. She's on Instagram. If you search the body image therapist, you'll find her handle. But she posts really beautiful, like, I don't know, it's almost like artwork with all of her like affirmations and just different perspectives on body image. And I share this with her account with my clients a lot, because she's really like, she says the thing that we know deep down is true in relation to how we relate to our body, but we don't always want to admit to ourselves. And so these affirmations are really lovely. Like, I choose to be on my body's side with curiosity, trust, and compassion rather than being against it. Regardless of cultural expectations, I follow my own values for appearance and embodiment. I have strengths that have nothing to do with my appearance. I live in a human body and it's normal and okay for it to change. That's like an affirmation that everyone needs, because bodies are supposed to change over time. And our society and culture really doesn't accept that. So that's a good one for everybody. And placing your worth outside of your appearance. So that, I think, is part of the recovery process of figuring out, what else you value. What else do you like about yourself? What are you learning to like about yourself, and trying to find that sense of self-worth in other things. And that's hard, but it's totally worth it when you figure it out. Yeah, so respecting your body, I kind of went on a tangent there. That's exactly what it says. So it's about accepting your set point weight range, right, where your body wants to fall into place. It can be about having gratitude for your body and what it can do. That doesn't necessarily mean body positivity as we kind of see it. You don't have to be like gung-ho, I love my body, but you may be able to take steps where you're not critical of it, where you're more neutral of it. And even that, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor, because even just being more neutral about it will reduce your own suffering, which is good. Trying to be respectful to your body through the behaviors, like going to bed when you need to, brushing your teeth, little things, based self-care. That's what it's about. But that kind of applies to eating disorder recovery too, right? Like, you shouldn't feel bad if you're using an eating disorder behavior, because it is a way to cope. But it can be kind of a different approach to how you relate to your body if it's a relationship of respect rather than of disdain or punishment. And again, that would take a lot of unlearning. Okay. So principle number 9, these last two are more of the more difficult principles that arguably come up in eating disorder recovery for most of my clients. Principle number 9 is where we address movement, and they do talk about it as movement rather than exercise or physical activity. And my first note is this is complicated in recovery. It's not always safe to move, depending on your situation. Your treatment team may want you to put restrictions in place when it comes to movement, and that should be a collaborative discussion, but you want to listen to them when they're talking about medical stability and all of that. But learning to have a relationship with movement that isn't one of like penance or punishment or compensation for what we're eating, that's really, really tricky. And this is very, very, if you struggle with this, like you are one of many people who do, in the sense that exercise and physical activity gets hijacked by the eating disorder for most people. And so what we might do in eating disorder recovery is you may have, restrictions on certain types of activities or for how long you do them. But eventually we take the time to actually ask ourselves, like, what do we actually like doing? Do we like doing anything with movement? Maybe not. And then the focus is like, what activities, like, how do they make us feel versus any sort of like body or number-based goals? And sometimes we keep restrictions in place with how much movement we do because we know the eating disorder hijacks it, but we also know this is a type of movement that's really meaningful for you. And so we have to do both. So yes, the eating disorder hijacks it. We have thoughts around our body and aesthetics, but we also really like the activity. So the compromise is to find something that, find that amount of time where we can do that activity safely and keep working on challenging the eating disorder side of it. So this is another dietitian I really like called New Moon RD. And she talks about like whether you should exercise. And I think she's talking from an eating disorder recovery. So what's my intention behind wanting to move is a question you can ask yourself. Do I feel confident in my ability to fuel and refuel my body properly? That's really important. Do I have the energy to move, or am I doing this out of obligation? Does it fit easily into my day-to-day? Sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay. You're not a worse person because you didn't move. And in recovery, that's an important lesson, I think. Have I gotten enough sleep? Would it feel good? Do I generally want to move? She has that versus feeling obligated. And my favorite question is, if this had no impact on my body shape or size, would I still choose to go? It's a really good filter for things that you're doing that really the eating disorder wants you to do versus things that you actually enjoy. So it's a good filter. And then the last one, feel shit and eat it anyway. I love that. That was a cake that was baked for Jennifer Rowland by a patient. And I thought that was really lovely. And someday I hope one of my patients bakes me a cake like that, because I think that's just like, yes, I've done my job if somebody bakes me a cake like that. So we need different amounts of food from day to day because we are not, in fact, robots. So that's Caroline Dooner, who is the author of the Fuck It Diet, which is really awesome. Honoring your health with gentle nutrition. This is the last principle. This is the most complicated one for eating disorder recovery, I would say, because nutrition information can so easily become food rules. So it can so easily become like a moral issue again with food. I like to think of gentle nutrition as like doing the mechanical eating, following the meal plan you're working on with your dietitian, adding something in so you're getting the nutrients you need. So you're actually treating malnourishment, and that is nutrition, but it's not restrictive. It's not rule-based. It's more about adding things in that you need, and it still should honor all those other things, like making peace with food and finding satisfaction and honoring your hunger. And the reality with nutrition is that there isn't a perfect way to eat or the exact right way. It's really different depending on the person, and the types of foods you eat, depending on your cultural background, are different. And so, my job as a dietitian is to help guide you into meeting your basic needs. But even I don't fully know all the time what that looks like for you. It's a bit of trial and error in recovery. and we do our best to guesstimate. Yeah. And so again, you're making food choices from a place of what your body needs to function, but also like what you actually like. Okay. So that is, those are the 10 principles of intuitive eating. I put my handle there. I'm on Instagram. I am on Twitter, but not really. Technically I'm there, and Facebook. That's my website, my email, and my work phone as well. And I have this little just like hopeful message that I really love from, her name is Jess Rachel Sharp on Instagram. And she does really beautiful, like inspirational, just like self-love wording, poems, artwork. And I like her stuff a lot. So yeah, that is everything. I will stop talking